Thank you so much. Yat a she Ahtza Chavez yinishe bitlatni nishle kis ani bashachin nakai dine deshache kis ane deshanele go at hopa ikani el giwumesuta. Thank you so much. My name is Ahtza Chavez. I introduced myself in Navajo and in my Keres language. But mine wanted to just kind of next slide, please. Just go over some things as some of the panelists had mentioned. Nava Education Project is one of the sister organizations that we use in the state of New Mexico to really bring all of these things kind of together. Our goal is to protect the continuity of our cultures and our communities, and we advocate for social, economic, and environmental justice through the principles of a lens of civic engagement and building a Native American electorate, excuse me. Next slide, please. One of the main reasons that we kind of came together was to uphold our communities and a lot of the things that we saw within the state that were not being addressed. And so we work directly with New Mexico's 23 Native American communities. Those include the 19 Pueblos, the Navajo Nation, the Hickory Apache Nation, and the Mescalero Apache tribe. The last 20th Pueblo is actually a Pueblo that is mostly in the side of Texas, but we have relatives here on the New Mexico side as well. And what we saw during the COVID pandemic was basically that a lot of our communities shut down completely. And the way that we saw that this affected civic engagement was there were 80 voting precincts along the state of New Mexico. And during the primary election, when we first heard that we had to reduce the number of polling locations, they immediately just kind of picked and choose our county clerks, which ones they closed. And unfortunately, they closed a lot of the Native American precincts. So we spent a lot of time trying to make sure that people were aware of these closures and tried to advocate during the actual general election to make sure that these lockdown measures did not disenfranchise our votership. These closures resulted in about a 10% drop in the Native American voter participation compared to the previous primary turnout data. Next slide, please. One of our main goals is to really educate our community and build on this goal of building our Native American electorate block. And so during the 2020 election seasons, it really came down to advocating across the board. Jocelyn mentioned that we have a partner organization called NM Native Vote. And so we kind of use our C3 and our C4 and our PAC as all the different tools in our toolbox to really push forward our agenda and make sure that we uphold a lot of the issues that are needed within our communities. I know that it was mentioned earlier that, you know, it's a whole spectrum of being involved. That's the census, that's redistricting, that's making sure that we have the funding that we need with these CARES Act funding that we're coming down to make sure that our communities have the infrastructure that they need. Our C3 organization is in the middle of expanding into more regional work. And one of the key reasons is because of infrastructure. COVID-19 really highlighted the fact that there is a lack of infrastructure within our communities. We have communities that don't even have electricity or running water, much less broadband internet. So when the CDC was saying, you know, just turn on your water and wash your hands for 5 minutes as a preventative measure, not many of our communities were able to do that. And so one of the bills that we advocated for was SB4. Next slide, please. And basically, this was to ensure that when our communities decided to preserve their elders in their communities by closing their borders, that they still were able to have their polling locations. So this is how we made sure that despite all of the stuff going on, that we still had voters going to the polls. We had a social media campaign. We did a really heavy phone banking campaign. We had an election ambassador program. One of the really cool things that we did as we had to figure out new methods of reaching our community was we did a geospatial kind of map around each one of our communities where they were able to target cell phones and laptops and tablets to get our message across. Next slide, please. And then in our social media, we pushed all of these things. So we literally called all of the county clerks for all of these 80 precincts to make sure that our community was aware of any changes in early voting spaces, where they were going to be able to go. Our Secretary of State pushed a absentee ballot that for folks who had COVID were able to still vote. So just getting all of that information out there. We created a tribal kind of toolkit for tribal nations to make sure that they had all of this information. Next slide, please. And so what it really did was it made sure that regardless of the pandemic, that from the primary where they made all these crazy changes to the general election, we had a 30% increase in our votership just because of all of this huge push to make sure that we were doing what we need to for our communities. And a large part of that is health-based. It's all cyclical. And so this is how we work together to make sure that our communities have a voice within the state. Thank you.